James Carter, 47 years old, was a financial professional living in New Jersey. His life seemed perfect: a beautiful house, a devoted wife, 2 grown children, and a stable job. Every morning he woke up at 6 a.m., jogged around his quiet suburban neighborhood, then drove to his office in Manhattan. In the evenings he returned home, had dinner with Lisa, his wife, and then they each retreated to their own corners. She watched her favorite Netflix shows, while he scrolled through the news on his phone. Everything repeated like clockwork, precise to the second. And yet, James couldn't deny the growing emptiness inside him. One cold December afternoon, James was at work when his phone vibrated. A messenger notification appeared on the screen. Emily Rogers. "Hey, it's been a long time, hasn't it?" James blinked as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. Emily, a former colleague, someone he hadn't seen in over 10 years. There had been something special between them. Not exactly love, but not just a professional relationship either. There were moments when they had looked at each other for longer than necessary, moments when they had almost crossed the line but never did. His heart pounded as he tapped the chat box. "I'm doing well. How about you?" he replied, his fingers trembling slightly. A few minutes later, Emily responded, "I just got divorced. Living alone in Manhattan. Want to grab a drink?" James stared at the message, then looked up. Lisa was at home, probably preparing dinner. A part of him wanted to type a polite rejection, but another part, after a brief hesitation, he typed back, "Absolutely." New York in winter was covered in a thin layer of snow on the cobblestone streets. James stepped into the small bar in Soho where Emily had chosen to meet. She was already there, wearing a form-fitting knit dress, her deep blue eyes glowing under the warm yellow lights. "You made it," she smiled, raising her cocktail. Everything felt natural, as if the past 10 years had never existed. They talked, reminisced about old memories, and laughed like they used to. Emily spoke about her failed marriage, about the lonely nights in her vast apartment. James, however, said little about Lisa, or maybe he just didn't want to bring her up at that moment. He didn't realize how many drinks he had until they stepped outside, and his hand instinctively brushed against Emily's. She didn't pull away. They started texting every day. At first, it was just casual conversations, but soon, their messages became more personal, more daring. Emily sent him pictures, not exactly provocative, but enough to stir the long-buried thoughts inside him. Lisa began to notice. James would often smile at his phone, come home later than usual, but she didn't suspect anything yet. A week later, Emily sent a message. "Would you like to come over to my apartment?" James stared at the screen. His finger hovered over the keyboard, caught between right and wrong. Then he typed, "Tomorrow night." Emily's apartment was on the 22nd floor, with large glass windows overlooking the dazzling city lights. James stood there, a glass of wine in his hand, absorbing the warmth and sweetness of the atmosphere. Emily approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "James," she whispered, her breath warm against his neck. His entire body tensed with anticipation. A voice in his head told him he shouldn't be doing this. But when Emily's lips met his, all logic melted away. The kiss started as an experiment but quickly turned into an unquenchable thirst. Emily moaned softly as James pressed her against the wall, his hands gripping her waist. Their breaths tangled, buttons popped open, skin burned against skin in the quiet of the room. That night, James didn't go home. James woke up to the scent of Emily lingering in the air. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting light over her bare skin. She turned to him, lips curling into a lazy smile. "Good morning," she murmured, tracing circles on his chest with her fingertip. James inhaled deeply, his mind clouded with guilt. He glanced at his phone, 5 missed calls from Lisa. But instead of rushing to leave, he pulled Emily closer. Her breath was warm against his neck, and in that moment, he was no longer a faithful husband. This wasn't just a one-night mistake. James and Emily began meeting more often, in boutique hotels, in her apartment, even in his car on rainy afternoons. Every touch was a wildfire. But alongside the passion, an undercurrent of anxiety crept in. Lisa started noticing his distance. The late nights, the whispered texts, the faint trace of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts. One night, while James was in the shower, Lisa picked up his phone. A message appeared on the screen. "Emily, I miss you. When can we meet again? Lisa didn't say a word. But from that night on, the way she looked at James was never the same. Then one evening, while James and Emily were tangled together on her sofa, the doorbell rang. James' heart pounded. They had never been caught before. Emily clutched a blanket around her body while James hurriedly buttoned his shirt. The knocking came again. Who is it? Emily whispered, panic in her voice. James glanced at his phone. A text from Lisa. Open the door, James.
Understand
James stood frozen, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. Lisa had never come to Manhattan at this hour. She had no reason to be here, unless she knew. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. How does she know? James had no answer. He took a deep breath, straightened his clothes, and walked to the door. When he opened it, Lisa stood there, wrapped in a thick sweater, her hair neatly tied back, her face unreadable. James, she said, her voice disturbingly calm. Aren't you going to invite me in? Without waiting for an answer, she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the apartment, the very place that had just been filled with passion between him and Emily. Emily clutched the blanket tighter around herself, but Lisa didn't look at her. Every ounce of her attention was on James. Do you have anything to say? Lisa asked. James swallowed hard, his mind racing for an excuse. But what was the point? The scene before them spoke for itself. I'm sorry, he muttered. Lisa laughed, a cold, emotionless sound. Sorry. She shook her head. How long has this been going on, James? He lowered his gaze. A few months. Lisa closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. When she opened them, they glistened, but no tears fell. So everything between us was just a lie? At that moment, James realized he had two choices. 1. Beg Lisa for forgiveness, leave Emily, and try to salvage his marriage. 2. Let go, accept losing everything, and chase his passion with Emily. He looked at Lisa, the woman who had stood by him for over 20 years, the mother of his children, the person who had shared every moment of his life. Then he turned to Emily, the woman who had made him feel alive again, who had ignited a fire he thought he had lost. The room fell into silence. James took a deep breath. His chest tightened. He looked at Lisa, then at Emily. Lisa didn't rush him. She stood there waiting. Emily, on the other hand, was restless, her eyes flickering with fragile hope. Finally, James spoke. I'm sorry, Lisa. The words spilled out like a death sentence. James saw Lisa close her eyes briefly, as if trying to suppress a deep, piercing pain. I love Emily, he continued, his voice hoarse. But I love you too. Lisa laughed, this time not with sarcasm, but with a bitter, exhausted smile. Then you should know, James, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You can't have both. She stepped closer, locking eyes with him. What were you thinking when you did this? She asked. Did you really believe you wouldn't get caught? Or did you think you deserved more than what you already had? James didn't answer. Lisa nodded, as if she had found the answer for herself. She turned away and walked toward the door. As her hand touched the doorknob, she hesitated for a second. She already knows, Lisa whispered. James froze. What? Lisa turned back, her eyes filled with quiet disappointment. Your daughter saw Emily's messages a long time ago. She didn't tell me because she wanted to see if you'd confess on your own. James felt as if someone had punched him in the gut. He had never considered this possibility. Lisa opened the door and left without looking back. James turned toward Emily. She was still sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her bare shoulders exposed, her eyes filled with worry. Are you okay? She asked softly. James didn't answer right away. He walked over to the kitchen counter, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and downed it in one gulp. Lisa was gone. Everything he had built over the past 20 years had crumbled. And worse, his daughter knew. At that moment, he realized that whether he chose Emily or not, his life would never be the same again. Emily stood up, reaching out to touch his hand. Everything will be okay, she whispered. But James knew that was a lie. A month later, James received the divorce papers from Lisa. No arguments, no tears, just a cold, clean ending. His daughter, Sophie, no longer spoke to him. Since the day she found out the truth, every call from James had been met with short, distant messages. "I'm busy," or "I don't want to talk right now." Emily was still with him, but it wasn't the same. Their once passionate nights had been replaced by long, empty silences. There were no more eager midday texts, no more sparkling eyes when they met. One night, as they sat in bed, Emily suddenly spoke. "Do you regret it?" James looked at her for a long time but didn't answer. He drove home, or rather to his new apartment. Smaller, emptier, with no laughter, no family dinners, just a cold bed and a plain kitchen counter. He opened a bottle of whiskey, poured himself a full glass, then picked up his phone. A photo appeared on the screen, a picture of their family taken last summer, back when they were happy. Lisa's radiant smile, Sophie standing between them, arms wrapped tightly around her parents. James sighed and turned off the screen. Do people only realize the value of what they have when it's lost forever? The next morning, James received a text from Lisa. She agreed to meet you, but just this once. His heart clenched. This was his chance to fix things, or at least to explain. He arrived at the cafe where Sophie had asked to meet. When he walked in, he saw his daughter sitting in the corner, her hair tied up high, her expression colder than before. James sat down, forcing a small smile. "Hi, sweetheart." Sophie looked at him for a moment, then spoke in an even tone. "Did you ever think about Mom and me? Before you did it?" James opened his mouth, but no words came out. That question, so simple yet unbearably heavy. In the end, Sophie stood up, put on her coat, and walked away, leaving James alone with his untouched, now cold coffee.